The question. Everyone asks, but asks the wrong way. People don't usually come to this topic calmly. They come to it late at night with their phone glowing in the dark, heart racing for no clear reason, typing a question they've never said out loud. Were my parents narcissistic? At first it feels like a dangerous question. Disloyal, dramatic, almost ungrateful. After all, nothing terrible happened. Right? They fed you. They showed up. They didn't abandon you. So why does your chest tighten when someone gives you feedback? Why do you replay conversations for hours? Why do you feel like you're always about to be exposed, corrected, or found lacking, no matter how accomplished you are? Here's what most people don't realize. That question, were my parents narcissistic, is usually not coming from curiosity. It's coming from confusion. And when confusion is often the aftershock of something that never had a name. Imagine this. You're doing fine in life, maybe even successful. You function. You're responsible. People trust you. But internally it feels like you're running an invisible race with no finish line. Rest feels undeserved. Mistakes feel dangerous. Praise feels temporary. And silence. Silence feels loud. So you start looking backward. You scan your childhood for evidence. You compare your parents to stories online. You wonder if you're being unfair, or too sensitive, or dramatic. And quietly another fear creeps in. What if the problem isn't them? What if it's me? This is where the question goes wrong. Because narcissistic parenting doesn't usually leave behind obvious memories of abuse. It leaves behind patterns. Patterns in how you think. Patterns in how you regulate emotions. Patterns in how you treat yourself when no one is watching. The truth is, many people raised by narcissistic parents don't remember feeling unloved. They remember feeling managed. They remember learning early how to read a room, how to anticipate moods, how to not ask for too much, how to stay composed, how to be easy. And they became very good at it. So good that even now, as adults, they don't feel traumatized. They feel wrong for struggling. This is why the most damaging question is not, were my parents narcissistic? The more revealing question is, what did I learn to do to myself in order to stay connected to my family? Because narcissistic parenting is not defined by rage or cruelty. It's defined by emotional gravity. The parent's needs, moods, image, and comfort quietly become the center of the system. The child learns without being told that love flows more easily when they adapt, suppress, perform, or self-correct. No one says, don't be yourself, but the message lands anyway. Over time, you stop noticing what you need. You stop trusting your internal signals. You become highly functional and deeply disconnected from yourself. And here's the part that shocks most people. The clearest evidence of narcissistic parenting doesn't live in your memories of them. It lives in your relationship with you. It shows up in the voice that speaks when you make a mistake, in how fast you blame yourself, in how uncomfortable it feels to need support, in how hard it is to relax without guilt. This is why so many adult children say, "And my childhood was fine, so why do I feel like this?" Because what shaped you most was not what happened once. It was what happened every day. What emotions were welcomed, which ones were ignored, what earned connection, what created distance. You didn't grow up asking, are my parents narcissists? You grew up asking without words, on how do I stay safe here? And your nervous system learned the answer. If this is already resonating, pause for a moment. Because in the next parts of this series, we're going to talk about the one sign that almost never lies. The sign people overlook because it feels so normal, so internal, so familiar that they assume it's just who they are. It's not. Before we go any further, if this kind of content speaks to something deep in you, something you haven't been able to articulate, subscribe to the channel. It's the best way to support this work and make sure you don't miss the next videos where we'll unpack this step by step with clarity and compassion. Now, before you continue, I want you to engage with this question. Be honest. Don't overthink it. Quick question. Comment A or B below. A. When I make a mistake, my inner voice is harsh, critical, and urgent. B. When I make a mistake, my inner voice is firm but supportive. Just comment A or B. Your answer says more about your upbringing than you might expect. And in the next part, you'll understand exactly why. What narcissistic parenting really looks like, beyond stereotypes. Most people think they know what narcissistic parenting looks like, and they imagine explosive anger, obvious cruelty, or a parent who openly dominates the household. They picture a villain, someone easy to point to, someone clearly bad. But for many adult children, narcissistic parenting didn't look like chaos. It looked like order. It looked like a home where things functioned. Bills were paid, schedules were kept, appearances mattered. From the outside, the family seemed stable, even admirable. And that's what makes it so difficult to recognize. Because narcissistic parenting is not defined by how loud it is. It's defined by what quietly revolves around the parent. In families like this, the parent's emotional world becomes the center of gravity. Not through threats or commands, but through subtle expectation. The child learns without ever being told that harmony depends on attunement, on reading the parent's mood, on adjusting accordingly. Love is present, but it is conditional in ways that are hard to name. Daniel grew up believing his parents were good people. They never hit him. They never screamed regularly. They showed up to school events and talked proudly about him to others. And yet, when he looks back now, one thing stands out more than anything else. There was very little room for him. Not his questions, not his uncertainty, not his confusion, not his emotional messiness. When he succeeded, the air felt lighter. When he struggled, it felt inconvenient. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of narcissistic parenting. It's not that the parent doesn't care, it's that they care in a way that centers themselves. The child is loved for what they provide emotionally: pride, validation, stability, a reflection of the parent's identity. The child is not met as a separate inner world with needs that might conflict with the parent's comfort, so the child adapts. They learn when to speak and when to stay quiet. They learn which emotions get approval and which get ignored. They learn how to be impressive, helpful, or invisible, whatever keeps the emotional temperature steady. And because no one ever says your feelings don't matter, the child never consciously thinks that. They just act as if it's true. This is what makes narcissistic parenting so difficult to spot later in life. There are no obvious scars, no single memory that explains everything. Just a slow shaping of identity around one central question. How do I stay connected without causing disruption? Over time, connection becomes something that must be earned, through achievement, through competence, through emotional restraint. Daniel remembers being praised for being mature for his age, responsible, independent, easy. What he didn't realize then was that these traits were not innate strengths. They were adaptations. He wasn't encouraged to need less. He learned to. Narcissistic parenting often involves parents who believe sincerely that they are doing the right thing. They may pride themselves on being strong, disciplined, or self-sacrificing. But strength without emotional curiosity becomes rigidity. Discipline without empathy becomes control. Sacrifice without self-awareness becomes leverage. The child doesn't experience this as abuse. They experience it as pressure. Pressure to perform, pressure to regulate themselves, pressure to not add weight to the system. And here's where it becomes even more confusing. Many narcissistic parents genuinely believe they are teaching independence. What they are often teaching instead is self-abandonment, because true independence grows from being emotionally supported while learning autonomy. What these children learn is autonomy instead of emotional support, so they become capable adults who don't know how to rest, high-functioning adults who don't know how to ask for help, responsible adults who feel deeply uncomfortable being cared for. Another hallmark of narcissistic parenting is the absence of emotional repair. In healthy families, misunderstandings happen, conflicts arise, and then something crucial occurs. Repair. The parent reflects, apologizes, reconnects. In narcissistic families, repair is rare, not because conflict doesn't happen, but because acknowledging harm threatens the parent's self-image. Instead of repair, the child learns to move on quickly, to let it go, to not dwell. Over time, this teaches the child that their emotional experience is not something that will be met or resolved. It will simply pass, or be buried. Daniel learned early not to expect emotional follow-up. If something hurt, it was easier to adjust internally than to risk dismissal. So he became skilled at minimizing his own reactions. That skill followed him into adulthood. In relationships, he was patient, accommodating, reasonable. But underneath, resentment accumulated quietly, unexpressed, unprocessed. This is another way narcissistic parenting shows itself later. Difficulty knowing where your limits are until you've crossed them. And because boundaries were never modeled as relational tools, they were experienced as disruptions. And perhaps the most overlooked feature of narcissistic parenting is this. The parent often appears more emotionally present to outsiders than to their own child. Friends see warmth, colleagues see generosity, extended family sees charm. The child sees a different version, more distracted, more preoccupied, more controlling, or more withdrawn. This creates deep confusion. If everyone else experiences the parent as caring, the child assumes the problem must be internal. Maybe they're too sensitive, maybe they're ungrateful, maybe they're the difficult one, so instead of questioning the system, they question themselves. This is how narcissistic parenting hides in plain sight. It doesn't create children who say, "And my parents hurt me." It creates adults who say something is wrong with me and I don't know why. And that belief follows them everywhere, into careers where self-worth is tied to performance, into relationships where needs feel risky, into moments of rest where guilt appears without invitation. Understanding what narcissistic parenting really looks like is not about blaming parents. It's about making sense of patterns that otherwise feel personal and inexplicable. Because once you see the system clearly, something important happens. You stop asking what's wrong with you, and you start asking what you learned to survive. That shift alone can change everything. The family trance. Why you thought this was normal. There is a reason so many people say it felt normal at the time. Not good, not safe, just normal. And this is one of the most powerful and least understood forces in narcissistic family systems. The family trance. It isn't a metaphor meant to sound poetic. It is a psychological reality. A shared emotional atmosphere that quietly teaches everyone inside it what is real, what is allowed, and what must never be questioned. Daniel didn't grow up thinking his family was dysfunctional. In fact, if you had asked him years ago, he would have defended them. They were responsible, put together. Compared to other families, they seemed calm. And that comparison mattered because the family trance doesn't ask, "Is this healthy?" It asks, "Is this familiar?" Children don't evaluate families, they adapt to them. A child has no external reference point for emotional health. There is no control group. There is only this family, this tone, in this set of rules, spoken and unspoken. Whatever happens repeatedly becomes reality. Whatever is ignored repeatedly disappears from awareness. That's how the trance begins. In narcissistic families, the most important rule is rarely stated outright. It's absorbed through experience. Don't disrupt the system. Don't ask questions that create discomfort. Don't express emotions that require attention. Don't need more than what's convenient. No one says, your feelings don't matter. The system simply moves on as if they don't. Over time, the child learns something far more dangerous than suppression. They learn reinterpretation. They learn to rename what they feel so it fits the family narrative. Sadness becomes being dramatic. Anger becomes being disrespectful. Confusion becomes overthinking. Need becomes selfishness. Eventually, and the child stops trusting their internal experience altogether. Daniel remembers moments when something felt off. Small moments, not dramatic ones. A dismissive comment, a sudden emotional withdrawal, a quiet tension that filled the room without explanation. When he tried to understand it, the response was always the same. Nothing was wrong. Or if something was wrong, it certainly wasn't that serious. So he adjusted his perception. This is how the family trance protects itself. It teaches the child that discomfort is not information, it's an error, something to correct internally rather than explore relationally. What makes this especially insidious is that narcissistic families often function well on the surface. There is order, predictability, sometimes even affection. The absence isn't obvious, it's subtle, and it's the absence of emotional curiosity, repair, and permission. And because there is no obvious harm, the child assumes the issue must be internal. This is why adult children often say things like, "Others had it worse," or "My parents did the best they could," even while describing symptoms of chronic anxiety, self-doubt, and emotional exhaustion. The family trance teaches gratitude as a form of silence. It teaches loyalty at the cost of truth. Daniel learned early that his role was to be steady, reliable, uncomplicated. He didn't experience this as a burden, he experienced it as identity. This is who I am, this is what I'm good at. The problem is that identities formed in a trance are not freely chosen. They are shaped by what keeps the system stable. In narcissistic family systems, stability is often valued more than authenticity, and the family may appear calm, but it is a fragile calm, one that depends on everyone playing their part. When a child senses this fragility, they don't rebel, they become careful, they scan for cues, they monitor emotional shifts. They preemptively self-correct, and eventually they forget they are doing it. This is why the family trance lasts so long. It doesn't end when the child leaves home, it moves inside them. Years later, Daniel found himself in professional settings feeling intense anxiety over mild feedback. Not because the feedback was harsh, but because it triggered something familiar. The sense that he had disrupted an invisible balance. His nervous system responded as if connection were at risk. That's the trance still working. Another hallmark of the family trance is selective memory. Not in the sense of denial, but in the sense of emphasis. Events that support the family narrative are remembered. Events that threaten it are minimized, reframed, or forgotten. If the family story is "we're fine," then any evidence to the contrary must be neutralized. So moments of emotional neglect are remembered as misunderstandings. Patterns of dismissal are remembered as personality differences. Chronic tension is remembered as just how things were. The child learns not to dwell. And this creates a specific kind of adult, someone who struggles to identify why they feel uneasy, because unease was never treated as meaningful. They may have difficulty naming emotions, difficulty trusting their intuition, and difficulty knowing when something is actually wrong versus when they are just being sensitive. The family trance teaches emotional amnesia, not because memories are erased, but because meaning is. Daniel didn't forget his childhood. He forgot how it felt to be unheard because he learned that feeling wasn't useful. This is why so many adult children don't recognize narcissistic dynamics until much later in life, often triggered by burnout, a failed relationship, or therapy. The trance only becomes visible when it stops working, when the strategies that once ensured belonging begin to cost too much, when being easy becomes exhausting, when being strong becomes lonely, when being adaptable becomes self-erasure. Breaking the family trance doesn't require blaming parents, it requires naming reality, and it requires allowing yourself to consider that what felt normal may not have been nourishing. And that consideration alone can feel destabilizing. Because if the trance breaks, a new question emerges, one that is both terrifying and liberating. If this wasn't normal, then who could I have been? This is why awareness often comes with grief. Not just grief for what happened, but grief for what never had the chance to develop. The family trance doesn't just shape behavior, it shapes imagination. And waking up from it is not an act of rebellion. It is an act of self-recognition. For Daniel, the first crack in the trance wasn't anger. It was curiosity. The quiet realization that his constant self-monitoring wasn't a personality trait. It was a learned response to an emotional environment that required vigilance. Once you see the trance, you can't unsee it. And once you stop calling it normal, you stop calling yourself broken. You begin to understand that your struggles were not random. They were intelligent adaptations to a system that asked you to disappear just enough to keep the peace. That understanding is not the end of the journey, but it is the moment you wake up, the number one sign revealed, the voice in your head. There is a moment many people remember long before they understand it. It's not a dramatic memory, no raised voices, no slammed doors. It's quieter than that. It's the moment you make a mistake and something inside you turns cold, not embarrassed, not disappointed, punitive, a sharp internal shift, a tightening. A voice that doesn't ask questions, doesn't seek understanding, doesn't pause. It simply declares, "You should have known better." And this is the sign most people miss. Not because it's subtle, but because it feels familiar. For Daniel, this voice showed up everywhere, at work after a small oversight, in relationships when he expressed a need and immediately regretted it. Even alone on days that should have felt calm, the voice stayed alert, scanning for flaws. It didn't scream. It didn't insult. It judged. And because it had always been there, Daniel assumed it was him. His personality, his standards, his drive. But here's the truth most adult children never hear. Your inner voice did not originate inside you. It was trained. The number one sign you were raised by narcissistic parents is not found in how you remember them. It's found in how you relate to yourself when no one is watching, especially when you fall short of your own expectations. This voice does not guide, and it corrects. It does not support, it pressures. It does not allow repair, it demands perfection, and it feels urgent. Urgency is one of the clearest fingerprints of narcissistic conditioning. Healthy self-discipline is firm but spacious. It leaves room for learning. It assumes worth is intact even when performance falters. The internal voice shaped by narcissistic parenting assumes the opposite, that mistakes threaten connection, safety, or belonging. So it intervenes quickly, harshly, preemptively, not to help you grow, but to prevent rejection. Daniel didn't consciously remember being criticized constantly as a child. That's what confused him. His parents weren't verbally abusive, they weren't openly demeaning. But the emotional atmosphere carried a different message. Approval was precise, attention was selective, and disappointment, though rarely spoken, was palpable. Children don't need words to learn what's dangerous. They learn through tone, withdrawal, subtle shifts in energy. So Daniel learned to monitor himself before anyone else could. Over time, that monitoring became internalized. The parent didn't need to be present anymore. The system had been installed. This is why adult children often say, "I'm really hard on myself, but that's what made me successful." It feels productive, it feels responsible, it feels virtuous, until it doesn't. until success brings no relief, until rest feels unsafe, until self-criticism becomes constant background noise instead of a situational response. Here's a crucial distinction that changes everything. There is a difference between self-reflection and self-surveillance. Self-reflection is curious. It asks, "When what happened? What can I learn?" Self-surveillance is punitive. It asks, "How did I mess this up? What's wrong with me?" Narcissistic family systems teach children self-surveillance, not self-awareness, because awareness would require acknowledging the system itself, and that is often not allowed. So instead of questioning the environment, the child questions themselves. Daniel noticed this most clearly when he watched how others treated themselves. Friends made mistakes and shrugged. Colleagues received feedback and moved on. Partners expressed needs without apologizing for existing. Meanwhile, his internal voice treated every misstep as evidence. Evidence that he wasn't careful enough. Evidence that he was asking for too much. Evidence that he needed to try harder. That voice wasn't cruel, but it was relentless. And relentlessness is not self-leadership. It is fear in disguise. One of the most revealing questions an adult child can ask is this: if someone I loved spoke to themselves the way I speak to myself, would I be concerned? For many, the answer is immediate: yes. That's because the voice in your head is not your authentic self. It is a role you were forced to adopt early. The internal manager, the self-corrector, the one who ensures you don't step out of line. In narcissistic parenting, external control often becomes internal control. The child learns, if I regulate myself well enough, maybe I won't cause discomfort. Maybe I won't be ignored. Maybe I'll stay connected. This strategy works in childhood, but in adulthood it becomes a cage. Because the voice does not know how to stop. It does not know when you are safe. And it does not know that you are no longer dependent. It still believes connection is fragile. That belief shows up most clearly in moments of vulnerability. When Daniel felt sad for no clear reason, the voice told him to be productive instead. When he felt overwhelmed, the voice told him to push through. When he felt proud, the voice warned him not to get comfortable. Joy was allowed, but only briefly. Rest was allowed, but only after exhaustion. Self-acceptance was allowed, but only conditionally. This is not ambition. It is emotional inheritance. And here's the part that often lands hardest. The voice in your head may sound reasonable. It may sound calm. It may even sound motivational. But motivation driven by fear does not create fulfillment. It creates compliance. Compliance with an internal authority that no longer serves you. And the tragedy is that many adult children spend years trying to soften this voice through willpower, through positive thinking, through discipline layered on top of discipline. They try to replace it with affirmations, without realizing they are still engaging it on its own terms. You cannot out-argue a voice that believes your worth is conditional. You must recognize it for what it is. Not you, not truth, not intuition, but an echo of an emotional environment where being acceptable mattered more than being real. When Daniel finally began to see this, it wasn't dramatic. There was no moment of rage or blame, just a quiet clarity. He realized that the voice in his head was not aligned with his values. It didn't reflect how he treated others. It didn't reflect what he believed about humanity. It reflected what had once been necessary. And that realization didn't silence the voice immediately, but it changed the relationship. Instead of obeying it, he began to notice it. Instead of assuming it was right, he questioned its urgency. Instead of confusing it with conscience, he recognized it as conditioning. This is where real healing begins, not by attacking the voice, but by understanding its origin. Because the goal is not to eliminate self-discipline. The goal is to replace internal punishment with internal leadership. And leadership is calm. Leadership is grounded. Leadership does not need to threaten. The moment you realize the harshness inside you is learned, not innate, is the moment shame loosens its grip. You stop asking, "Why am I like this?" and start asking, "What happened that made this necessary?" That shift changes everything, because once you see the voice clearly, you can begin to build a different one. One that doesn't disappear when you fail. One that doesn't abandon you when you rest. One that doesn't confuse worth with performance. And that voice, slowly, patiently, is the sound of coming home to yourself. Guilt, shame, and the false fear of being a narcissist. There is a moment that quietly terrifies many adult children, and it often arrives just as they begin to understand their past. It's the moment they ask themselves, almost in a whisper, "What if I'm the narcissist?" Not out of arrogance, out of fear. This fear doesn't come from entitlement or grandiosity. It comes from conscience, from a deep sensitivity to impact, from an almost obsessive concern about hurting others, being unfair, being selfish, being too much. Daniel encountered this fear not when he was at his worst, but when he was finally slowing down enough to notice himself. Therapy didn't immediately bring relief. At first it brought panic. The more he reflected, the more he questioned his motives. The more he learned about narcissism, the more he scanned himself for signs. And that scanning felt familiar. Adult children of narcissistic parents are often haunted by a specific kind of self-doubt, the belief that if something went wrong in the relationship, it must be because they failed morally. This is not coincidence, it is conditioning. In narcissistic family systems, responsibility rarely flows upward. The parent's self-image must remain intact, so discomfort is subtly redirected downward. The child becomes the emotional container for what the parent cannot tolerate: guilt, shame, inadequacy, doubt. Over time, and the child learns that being good means being vigilant. Vigilant about tone, vigilant about impact, vigilant about intentions. So when that child grows into an adult, guilt does not arise only when they've done something wrong. It arises when they exist imperfectly. This is where shame enters. Guilt says, "I did something wrong." Shame says, "Something is wrong with me." Narcissistic individuals avoid shame at all costs. They deflect it, project it, or deny it. Adult children of narcissistic parents absorb it and carry it everywhere. This distinction matters more than most people realize. The fear of being narcissistic is often strongest in those who are least likely to be narcissists. Because narcissism is not defined by self-examination, it is defined by the absence of it. And Daniel didn't fear being narcissistic because he lacked empathy. He feared it because he had too much. Because he replayed conversations, because he worried about his tone days later. Because he felt responsible not just for what he said, but for how others might feel about it. That level of concern is not narcissism. It is hyper-responsibility. Hyper-responsibility develops in environments where emotional safety is conditional, where being attuned to others' reactions is a survival skill, not a choice. As a child, Daniel learned that conflict didn't lead to repair. It led to distance, or silence, or subtle disapproval. So he learned to preempt it. That preemption became internalized as guilt. Not the healthy kind that signals values, but the chronic kind that never fully resolves. And this is why adult children often confuse self-awareness with self-accusation. They don't simply reflect, they prosecute. They ask questions like, "Was I selfish for needing that? Did I overreact? Was my boundary unfair? Am I just like them?" These questions don't come from entitlement. They come from fear of becoming the source of pain. Ironically, this fear often keeps adult children trapped in patterns of self-erasure. They overcorrect. They minimize. They apologize for needs that are reasonable. They tolerate dynamics that don't feel right. because they'd rather doubt themselves than risk being the bad one. This is how narcissistic conditioning perpetuates itself internally, even when the original environment is gone. Daniel noticed this pattern most clearly in relationships. When conflict arose, his first instinct was not to understand both sides. It was to find his own fault. Even when he had been hurt, his guilt was louder than his pain. This didn't make him emotionally mature. It made him emotionally invisible. Here is a truth that reframes everything. Narcissism does not ask, "Am I harming others?" It asks, "Why are they upset with me?" Concern about your impact, fear of becoming controlling, anxiety about fairness. These are not narcissistic traits. They are often the residue of growing up with someone who could not tolerate their own imperfection. So the child learned to carry it for them. Another way this fear shows up is in the way adult children relate to power. They are uncomfortable with authority, but also uncomfortable having it. Leadership brings anxiety. Saying no brings guilt. Taking up space feels risky. Why? And because power was modeled as something dangerous, something that hurt people. Daniel didn't want to resemble the emotional authority he grew up under, so he unconsciously limited himself. He stayed agreeable, flexible, reasonable, even when it cost him. This is the paradox of narcissistic parenting. It often creates adults who are so afraid of harming others that they harm themselves instead. The false fear of being narcissistic keeps people stuck in self-surveillance. It keeps them proving their goodness through self-denial. But goodness is not proven through suffering. Healing begins when guilt is placed back where it belongs. Some guilt is appropriate, some shame is inherited, and some fear is simply old information that hasn't been updated. Daniel's turning point came when he recognized a pattern. The moments he feared being narcissistic were the moments he was asserting a need, expressing a boundary, or prioritizing himself. In other words, the fear appeared exactly where autonomy began. That's not coincidence, that's conditioning. In a narcissistic system, the child's independence can feel like betrayal. The child internalizes this and grows into an adult who equates selfhood with harm. Undoing that belief takes time. It requires learning to distinguish between empathy and self-erasure, between accountability and self-blame, between narcissism and self-respect. One of the most important questions adult children can ask is this: when I feel guilty, am I responding to something I actually did or to something I was trained to feel? The answer is rarely obvious at first, but asking the question loosens the grip of shame. It creates space between who you are and what you learn to carry. The goal is not to eliminate guilt. The goal is to make it accurate, because accurate guilt leads to repair. Inaccurate guilt leads to self-abandonment. Daniel didn't stop caring about his impact. He stopped assuming he was the problem by default. That shift didn't make him cold. It made him grounded. He learned that being thoughtful does not require being small. That having empathy does not require self-punishment. That integrity does not require erasing his own needs. The fear of being narcissistic fades when you begin to trust your values instead of interrogating your existence. And perhaps the most freeing realization of all is this: you are not responsible for proving that you are not your parents, yet you are responsible for becoming yourself. That responsibility is not heavy. It is honest. And when guilt and shame finally loosen their grip, what remains is not narcissism, but clarity. Clarity about where you end and others begin. Clarity about what belongs to you and what never did. Clarity about the difference between power and presence. That clarity is not the end of healing, but it is the moment you stop being afraid of your own humanity. How narcissistic parenting hijacks your nervous system. Most people assume that if something hurt them, they would remember it clearly. They expect trauma to live in memories. But narcissistic parenting often doesn't lodge itself in memory first. It lodges itself in the nervous system. Long before Daniel could articulate what felt wrong in his family, his body already knew, and he just didn't have language for it yet. He lived with a low-level tension that never fully turned off. Not fear exactly, more like vigilance, a constant readiness to adjust. This is what happens when a child grows up in an environment where emotional safety is unpredictable. The nervous system is designed to answer one core question: am I safe right now? In healthy families, the answer fluctuates but returns to yes. Emotions rise, conflicts happen, and then the system settles. Repair occurs, calm is restored. In narcissistic family systems, the answer is rarely a stable yes, not because danger is obvious, but because safety is conditional. Conditional on mood, conditional on performance, conditional on not being a burden, conditional on not disrupting the emotional equilibrium. A child cannot reason their way through this, and they adapt biologically. Daniel's parents didn't need to yell for his body to learn this lesson. All it took was inconsistency. Warmth one moment, withdrawal the next. Approval that felt precise and easily lost. So his nervous system learned to stay alert. This is how narcissistic parenting hijacks regulation. It trains the body to associate connection with monitoring. The child's system becomes oriented outward instead of inward. Rather than asking, "What do I feel?" the nervous system asks, "What's happening around me? What do they need? What mood are they in?" This is not emotional intelligence, it is survival intelligence, and it comes at a cost. As an adult, Daniel often felt anxious without knowing why. Nothing was wrong, no threat was present, but his body behaved as if something needed managing. And this is because the nervous system does not update automatically with age. It updates with experience. If calm was never reliably safe in childhood, calm can feel suspicious in adulthood. Many adult children describe this paradox. When life slows down, anxiety increases. When there's chaos, they feel oddly competent, focused, useful. That's not coincidence. A nervous system shaped by narcissistic parenting often becomes most regulated in stress because stress feels familiar. It knows what to do there. Calm, on the other hand, feels undefined. Daniel noticed this pattern when he tried to rest. Vacations felt uncomfortable. Stillness made him restless. His mind searched for problems to solve, improvements to make, ways to be better. Not because he was ambitious, but because his nervous system didn't recognize safety without effort. Another hallmark of nervous system hijacking is reactivity without clarity. Small things trigger big responses: a delayed text, a vague comment, a change in tone. Suddenly the body floods with tension, urgency, or shame. The mind scrambles to justify it. What did I do wrong? Did I miss something? Should I fix this? This response is not immaturity. It is pattern recognition gone unchecked. Daniel's nervous system learned early that subtle shifts mattered, that silence meant something, that emotional withdrawal could signal danger. So as an adult, his body responded before his mind could assess reality. This is why logic alone doesn't resolve these reactions. You can tell yourself you're safe. You can understand your parents intellectually. You can know you're not a child anymore and still feel hijacked. Because the nervous system is not convinced by insight. It is convinced by repeated experiences of safety. Narcissistic parenting often disrupts the development of self-regulation by outsourcing it. Instead of being soothed by a caregiver, the child learns to self-soothe preemptively by controlling themselves. That might look like emotional restraint, or hyper-independence, or perfectionism, or people-pleasing. All of these are regulation strategies. Daniel wasn't naturally calm as a child. He learned to be non-reactive because emotional expression felt risky. His nervous system equated expression with consequences, so he learned to stay composed. Later, people admired this trait. He was steady under pressure, reliable, unflappable. What they didn't see was the internal cost. Inside, his body was always working, and this is one of the most painful realizations for adult children. Traits they were praised for are often the very adaptations that exhaust them now. Another way narcissistic parenting hijacks the nervous system is through chronic low-grade stress. Not acute trauma, not explosive moments, but prolonged emotional tension without resolution. The nervous system doesn't need catastrophe to become dysregulated. It needs uncertainty without repair. When a child doesn't know what will restore connection, their system stays activated. Daniel rarely felt overt fear growing up, but he rarely felt deep ease either. There was always something to manage, something to anticipate. As an adult, this showed up as difficulty relaxing into relationships. He could connect, but intimacy brought a subtle tension. He was always tracking, adjusting, in making sure things were okay. That vigilance wasn't about his partners, it was about history. Narcissistic family systems often lack one critical element: emotional completion. Feelings arise, but they don't resolve. Conversations happen, but they don't integrate. Conflict exists, but it doesn't repair. The nervous system is left hanging, so it learns not to discharge stress. It learns to hold it. Over years, this becomes the baseline. Adult children often describe this as feeling wired but tired, energetic but depleted, capable but fragile. Daniel didn't understand why therapy initially made him more anxious. Talking about the past brought sensations he had spent decades managing unconsciously. This is common. When the nervous system has been hijacked, awareness can feel destabilizing before it feels freeing. And because for the first time the body is allowed to speak. Healing at this level is not about rehashing memories. It's about learning to experience safety in the present. Learning that rest does not lead to loss. That boundaries do not lead to abandonment. That emotions can rise and fall without catastrophe. This takes time because it is biological re-education. The nervous system must learn that the danger has passed. Daniel's breakthrough was subtle. He noticed that when he slowed down and didn't immediately self-correct, nothing terrible happened. When he expressed discomfort calmly, the world didn't collapse. When he rested, connection didn't disappear. These experiences began to update his system, not all at once. Gradually. This is why advice like just relax or just calm down often feels invalidating, and it ignores the intelligence of the nervous system. The body is not broken, it is loyal. It learned what it needed to learn to survive. Narcissistic parenting doesn't create weak nervous systems, it creates over-adapted ones. Systems that learn to prioritize connection over regulation, others over self. Stability over truth. Reclaiming regulation means gently reversing that priority. Learning to ask, what do I feel right now? What do I need to feel safe? Can I allow my body to settle without earning it? Daniel is still learning this. There are days his system snaps back into vigilance, days when urgency returns, days when rest feels uncomfortable. But now, he recognizes it. He no longer mistakes activation for intuition. He no longer treats tension as instruction. He no longer assumes anxiety means something is wrong. And that awareness doesn't erase the past, but it changes the present, because the nervous system can learn again. And when it does, something profound happens. Life becomes quieter. Decisions feel less desperate. Connection feels less fragile. Not because everything is perfect, but because the body finally understands that it is allowed to stand down. That understanding is not intellectual. It is felt. And it is the foundation of everything that comes next. Why just be kinder to yourself doesn't work. Just be kinder to yourself. It sounds gentle, reasonable, even wise. And for someone who has never lived inside a narcissistic family system, it might even work. But for adult children like Daniel, this advice often lands flat, or worse, it creates another quiet failure. He heard it everywhere, from friends, from books, and from well-meaning therapists early on. Whenever he talked about the harsh voice in his head, the chronic guilt, the exhaustion that came from always trying to do better, the answer was simple. You're too hard on yourself, you need to be kinder. So he tried. He told himself nicer things, he practiced affirmations, he reminded himself that he was doing his best. And then something strange happened. The voice didn't soften, it got sharper. Because the problem was never a lack of kindness. The problem was misidentification. When you tell someone raised by narcissistic parents to be kinder to yourself, you are asking the wrong part of them to do the work. Daniel wasn't being unkind because he hated himself. He was being harsh because a part of him believed harshness was necessary, protective, responsible, moral. And that part did not respond to gentleness. It interpreted gentleness as risk. This is the crucial misunderstanding. In narcissistic family systems, self-criticism is not a personality flaw. It is a strategy that once kept the child connected, safe, or invisible enough to survive emotionally. So when you try to simply replace it with kindness, the system resists. Because from the inside, kindness feels like negligence. It feels like letting your guard down, like inviting chaos, like forgetting the rules that once mattered. Daniel noticed this every time he tried to self-soothe. A wave of discomfort followed, not relief. Guilt, restlessness, a subtle panic that he was letting something slide. That reaction wasn't random, it was conditioned. In his family, vigilance had been rewarded, emotional restraint had been praised. His self-correction had been interpreted as maturity. So the part of him that criticized was not cruel, it was loyal. It believed it was doing its job. This is why advice that bypasses context doesn't work. It treats the symptom as the problem and ignores the system that created it. Kindness without understanding feels unsafe. Another reason just be kinder to yourself fails is because it places responsibility back on the individual without addressing the origin of the voice they are fighting. Daniel wasn't lacking compassion. He extended it generously to others. What he lacked was permission. Permission to stop performing regulation on behalf of an internalized authority. When people say, "Talk to yourself like you would talk to a friend," they assume the listener knows how to do that internally. But many adult children don't, and because they were never spoken to that way consistently. The internal landscape they inherited did not include warmth paired with authority. It included correction paired with closeness. So when Daniel tried to speak kindly to himself, it felt artificial, unconvincing, like a script written in the wrong language. This often leads adult children to conclude that self-compassion just isn't for them, that they're too broken, too rigid, too resistant. But resistance is not failure. Resistance is information. It tells you that there is a part of you that does not yet feel safe enough to stand down. In narcissistic parenting, safety was conditional. The child learned that being acceptable required constant monitoring. That part of the psyche does not relax because someone asks it to. It relaxes when it understands it is no longer needed. And this is why insight alone is insufficient, and kindness alone is ineffective. What actually helps is contextualizing the voice. Daniel began to make progress when he stopped trying to silence his inner critic and started asking different questions. Not, "How do I get rid of this?" but "What does this part believe will happen if it stops?" The answers surprised him. It believes you'll fail. It believes you'll disappoint people. It believes you'll become careless, selfish, or rejected. It believes connection will be lost. Those beliefs weren't irrational, they were outdated. But until they were acknowledged, no amount of kindness could override them. This is where many healing approaches fall short. They attempt to install compassion on top of fear without addressing the fear's logic. Fear does not dissolve when ignored, it tightens. Daniel learned that before kindness could land, safety had to be established. Not theoretical safety, lived safety. He needed experiences where he did less and nothing collapsed. Where he said no and wasn't abandoned. Where he rested and didn't lose respect. Only then did the nervous system begin to update. Only then did kindness stop feeling like negligence and start feeling like leadership. Another reason just be kinder to yourself doesn't work is that it assumes the self is unified. It's not. Adult children of narcissistic parents often have deeply divided inner worlds. Parts that comply, parts that observe, parts that punish, parts that hide. Kindness aimed at the whole self misses the part that actually holds the fear. Daniel noticed that when he tried to be gentle globally, the critical part felt ignored. And when he acknowledged it specifically, its role, its history, its exhaustion, something shifted. It didn't disappear, but it softened, because being seen is often more regulating than being contradicted. This is the paradox. The part that seems most hostile is often the part that has been working the hardest for the longest. Telling it to be quiet without understanding its function only reinforces its urgency. And there's another layer that makes be kinder to yourself ineffective in narcissistic systems: moralization. Adult children are often praised for being selfless, generous, and accommodating. These traits become moral identities. Kindness toward others is virtuous. Kindness toward the self feels suspicious. Daniel carried an unspoken belief that focusing on himself was selfish. Even when he intellectually rejected that idea, his body reacted as if it were true. So kindness triggered shame, not because kindness was wrong, but because self-focus had been implicitly discouraged for years. Until that belief was named and challenged, kindness felt like a violation of character. This is why self-compassion work often needs to begin with redefining responsibility. Responsibility does not mean self-punishment. Care does not mean indulgence. Rest does not mean failure. But these distinctions cannot be forced. They must be experienced. Daniel's breakthrough didn't come from saying nicer things to himself. It came from noticing when the critical voice showed up and choosing not to obey it automatically. That pause mattered. In that pause, he wasn't kind yet. He was curious, and curiosity is often the bridge between punishment and compassion. Over time, he began to feel the difference between guidance and threat, between correction and condemnation. Kindness emerged organically, not as a command but as a byproduct of safety. This is the truth few people say plainly. You don't become kinder to yourself by trying harder. You become kinder to yourself when the part of you that believes harshness is necessary finally realizes it can rest. That realization doesn't come from slogans, it comes from consistency. From boundaries that hold, from relationships that don't punish honesty. From moments where imperfection does not lead to loss. Only then does kindness stop feeling like weakness. Only then does it feel like truth. And when that happens, the inner world becomes quieter. Not because you forced it to be, but because it no longer needs to shout to keep you safe. That's not self-help, and that's repair. The fantasy that keeps you stuck. Self-differentiation, the skill that changes everything. Self-differentiation is one of those ideas that sounds abstract until the moment you feel it in your body. Before that moment, it's often misunderstood as distance, detachment, or emotional coldness. Many adult children hear the word and think it means cutting people off, becoming hardened, or no longer caring. For someone raised in a narcissistic family system, that misunderstanding makes sense. Closeness was never safe unless it came with self-erasure, so any move toward autonomy feels like abandonment. But self-differentiation is not about leaving. It is about arriving fully as yourself. Daniel didn't encounter this concept through theory. He encountered it through exhaustion. Years of insight, empathy, and effort had brought him understanding, but not peace. He could explain his family dynamics clearly. He could articulate his patterns. And yet in real-time interactions, his body still reacted as if he were 12 years old. Self-differentiation is the skill that addresses this gap. It is not a mindset. It is not a boundary script. It is an internal position. At its core, self-differentiation means the ability to stay connected to others without losing access to your own thoughts, values, and emotional stability. It means being able to say, internally and externally, you are you, and I am me, without hostility or collapse. This is incredibly difficult for adult children of narcissistic parents because enmeshment was normalized early. Emotional boundaries were blurred. Feelings traveled invisibly between people. Your attention became contagious. Approval became regulating, so the child learned that separation felt dangerous. Daniel's early attempts at differentiation felt wrong. When he disagreed calmly, guilt flooded in. When he held a boundary, anxiety spiked. When he didn't explain himself thoroughly, his body reacted as if something terrible was about to happen. This reaction is not resistance to growth. It is withdrawal from a system that once depended on your compliance. Self-differentiation challenges one of the deepest beliefs installed in narcissistic families, that connection requires sameness. In healthy systems, closeness is supported by difference. People can disagree, feel differently, want different things, and still remain emotionally connected. In narcissistic systems, difference threatens stability, so it is subtly discouraged. Daniel learned that staying emotionally aligned mattered more than being emotionally honest. That lesson didn't disappear just because he grew up. This is why self-differentiation feels like a skill rather than a decision. You don't wake up one day and choose it. You practice it in moments where your instinct is to fuse or flee, and you do neither. You stay. You stay present. You stay regulated. You stay anchored in yourself. That last part is crucial. Self-differentiation begins internally. Before any conversation, before any boundary, before any explanation, it begins with the ability to notice when your emotional state is being hijacked by someone else's reaction. Daniel started to recognize this in subtle ways. A comment from his parent would land and his body would tense. Not because the comment was objectively harmful, but because his nervous system interpreted it as destabilizing. In the past, he would react, justify, defend, appease, or withdraw. Differentiation offered a third option. He learned to pause, not to suppress, not to explode, but to orient back to himself. What do I actually think right now? What do I feel, separate from what they feel? What do I value here? These questions sound simple. They are not, because for someone raised in emotional fusion, asking them feels like betrayal. Self-differentiation often triggers grief before it brings relief. Grief for how much of yourself you had to give up to stay connected. Grief for how unsafe it felt to be separate. Daniel felt this grief when he realized that many of his reactions were not choices. They were reflexes shaped by proximity to others' emotions. Self-differentiation is the process of turning reflex into response, and response requires regulation. This is why differentiation is inseparable from calmness, not passivity. Calmness. Calmness allows you to think while staying connected. It allows you to hold your ground without becoming rigid. It allows you to hear disagreement without collapsing or counterattacking. In narcissistic families, calmness is often mistaken for compliance, or worse, indifference. But true calmness is grounded. It is active. Daniel noticed that when he remained calm while holding a boundary, the system reacted. Resistance showed up. Guilt-inducing comments, subtle pressure, emotional escalation. This is normal. Differentiation destabilizes dysfunctional systems because it removes the leverage of reactivity. When Daniel no longer reacted automatically, and the familiar dance stopped working. This is where many adult children retreat. They interpret discomfort as failure and return to old patterns. But discomfort is not failure. It is evidence of change. Self-differentiation does not require confrontation. It requires consistency. It is shown in small moments. Not rushing to explain yourself, not over-apologizing, not absorbing someone else's disappointment as your responsibility, not correcting your feelings to make others comfortable. Daniel practiced this first in low-stakes situations. He noticed how quickly he tried to smooth things over, how often he preemptively adjusted his tone, how reflexively he made himself smaller. Each time he resisted that impulse, not aggressively but deliberately, something shifted. Not externally at first, internally. He began to feel more solid. The self-differentiation creates an internal reference point. Instead of using others' reactions to decide who you are, you consult your own values. This is not selfishness. It is self-definition, and it changes everything. Because once you are self-defined, you no longer need to manage others' emotions to feel safe. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop fusing care with self-sacrifice. Daniel learned that he could remain respectful without being compliant, honest without being harsh, present without being absorbed. That balance is the heart of differentiation. Another misconception is that self-differentiation requires distance. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. The goal is not separation, the goal is non-enmeshment. You can be close and differentiated, you can be distant and fused. What matters is whether your sense of self collapses in the presence of others. Daniel found that as his differentiation increased, some relationships improved, others became clearer, a few became unsustainable. This is not a failure of differentiation, it is a result. Because differentiation reveals reality. It shows you where connection is mutual and where it depends on your self-erasure. This clarity can be painful, but it is stabilizing. The most profound change for Daniel was not how others responded. It was how he felt afterward. Interactions no longer lingered in his body. He didn't replay conversations for hours. He didn't scan himself for errors. That quiet was new. Self-differentiation does not make life conflict-free. It makes it cleaner. Conflicts end where they occur. Emotions move through instead of sticking. An identity becomes less reactive. And perhaps most importantly, differentiation allows adult children to stop living pendulum lives, swinging between compliance and rebellion, closeness and distance, guilt and withdrawal. Instead, they find center. Daniel still feels discomfort at times, still notices old impulses, still has moments where anxiety whispers that he's doing something wrong. But now, those signals are no longer commands, they are information. And information can be evaluated. Self-differentiation is not about becoming invulnerable. It is about becoming ungovernable by other people's emotional states. When you reach that place, something profound happens. You stop asking, how do I keep this relationship? And start asking, how do I show up as myself within it? That question changes everything. And because relationships that require you to disappear cannot be healed by better techniques, they can only be met with clarity. Self-differentiation is not the end of healing, but it is the skill that allows healing to stick. Without it, insight floats, boundaries wobble, growth resets under pressure. With it, you remain you no matter who you're with. And for someone raised in a narcissistic system, that is not just growth. It is freedom. Reparenting yourself. It's never too late for a happy childhood. There is a sentence that sounds almost offensive the first time many adult children hear it. It's never too late to have a happy childhood. For Daniel, those words didn't land as comforting. They felt absurd, almost cruel. His childhood was over. The house, the routines, the emotional rules, those years were gone. And what could that sentence possibly mean? But over time, he realized something important. Childhood doesn't end when the calendar says it does. It ends when the inner child finally has someone safe to turn toward. For many people raised by narcissistic parents, that moment never came. So the child kept waiting, waiting to be seen, waiting to be protected, waiting to be guided instead of corrected, waiting to be allowed to feel without consequences. Reparenting yourself is not about pretending the past didn't happen. It is about recognizing that development was interrupted and that interruption can be addressed now, not by becoming childish, but by becoming the parent you never had. Daniel resisted this idea at first. It felt self-indulgent. He had survived. He was functional. He didn't want to dwell on the past. And like many adult children, he believed that focusing on himself was a form of weakness. That belief itself was inherited. In narcissistic family systems, parenting is often transactional. Care is conditional. Guidance is fused with control. The child learns to meet expectations rather than explore needs. So when adulthood arrives, something is missing, not skills, but internal support. Reparenting begins with naming that absence without judgment. Daniel began to notice how he treated himself when things went wrong. Not just the critical voice, but the lack of comfort that followed. There was correction, analysis, and pressure to do better. But there was no reassurance, no containment, no sense of being held emotionally. That's when it clicked. He had internalized authority but not care. Reparenting is the process of installing what was never modeled: safety, consistency, and attunement. And it doesn't happen through grand gestures. It happens in moments that feel almost insignificant. When you're tired and don't push anyway. When you're confused and don't shame yourself for it. When you're hurting and don't rush to explain it away. This is where most people misunderstand reparenting. They imagine affirmations, indulgence, or letting themselves off the hook. But real parenting is not permissive. Healthy parents don't eliminate limits. They create safe structure. Daniel didn't need someone to tell him everything was okay all the time. He needed someone to help him regulate without fear, to guide without threat, to encourage without conditions. So he began practicing something unfamiliar. Staying with himself when discomfort arose. When anxiety surfaced, he didn't immediately distract or criticize. He paused, not to fix, but to notice. What am I feeling right now? What does this remind me of? What would have helped me then? These questions were not about reliving the past. They were about meeting the present with maturity and care. Reparenting is often described as inner child work, but that language can be misleading. This isn't about indulging nostalgia or recreating innocence. It's about developmental completion. Certain emotional capacities, self-soothing, self-trust, emotional permission, develop through relational experiences. When those experiences are inconsistent or absent, the capacities remain underdeveloped. They don't disappear, they wait. Daniel noticed that parts of him reacted with disproportionate fear or shame to ordinary situations. He didn't judge these reactions anymore. He saw them as signals of unmet needs. That shift was crucial. Instead of asking, why am I like this, he asked, what is this part still missing? Reparenting is not a rejection of responsibility. It is the foundation of it. Without internal support, responsibility becomes punishment. With internal support, responsibility becomes stewardship. One of the most important elements of reparenting is predictability. Narcissistic parenting often involves emotional inconsistency, warmth and withdrawal, approval and silence, attention and absence. The child learns that care is unreliable. So as an adult, the nervous system expects instability, even from the self. Daniel realized that he often abandoned himself emotionally the moment things got hard. He pushed, he minimized, he overrode his own limits. Reparenting meant doing the opposite. When something felt overwhelming, he practiced staying, not fixing, not escaping. Staying. That alone began to create trust. Trust doesn't come from promises, it comes from repetition. Over time, Daniel's internal world became less chaotic, not because his life changed dramatically, but because his response to life did. Another critical aspect of reparenting is permission. Children raised by narcissistic parents often grew up without permission to feel fully. Emotions were tolerated only if they were convenient, flattering, or brief. Reparenting means granting retroactive permission. Permission to be sad without justification. Permission to be angry without explanation. Permission to rest without earning it. Permission to want without shame. This permission does not make you selfish. It makes you honest. Daniel struggled most with permission to rest. Rest felt dangerous, like something would fall apart if he stopped. That fear didn't come from logic, it came from history. So instead of forcing rest, he practiced something smaller. Slowing down without stopping. Allowing moments of ease without demanding productivity. This gradual approach mattered. Reparenting respects pace. Just as a good parent wouldn't force growth, self-reparenting doesn't rush healing. Another misunderstood element of reparenting is discipline. Many adult children swing between extremes, harsh self-control or total burnout. Healthy parenting lives in the middle, and Daniel learned to set limits with himself that were not punitive. Not "you have to do this or else," but "this matters and I'm here with you." That tone changed everything. Discipline became supportive instead of threatening. Reparenting also involves learning how to play, not perform, not achieve. Play. This can feel uncomfortable for adult children. Play was often discouraged unless it served a function: entertainment, pride, distraction. Daniel noticed that he struggled to do things simply because he enjoyed them. Pleasure felt suspicious, unproductive. So he practiced low-stakes joy, activities with no outcome, walks with no destination, creativity without evaluation. These weren't indulgences, they were corrective experiences. They taught his nervous system that enjoyment did not lead to loss of connection. And one of the most powerful aspects of reparenting is learning how to talk to yourself during failure. Not with affirmations, with presence. When Daniel made mistakes, he practiced not abandoning himself, not jumping to correction, not rushing to be better. Instead, he stayed. That stay was everything. Children don't need perfect parents. They need parents who stay emotionally present during difficulty. So do adults. Reparenting is not about becoming someone new, it's about becoming consistent. Consistent in how you respond to pain. Consistent in how you treat vulnerability. Consistent in how you protect your own well-being. Over time, this consistency creates something profound: internal safety. And internal safety changes how you relate to the world. Daniel noticed that he stopped searching externally for validation in the same way, and he still valued connection, but he no longer needed it to regulate his worth. That's what a good childhood gives you, a sense that you are okay even when things are not. Reparenting also changes how you relate to your actual parents. Not because it fixes the relationship, but because it removes the need for them to complete you. Daniel didn't become indifferent, he became less reactive. He no longer needed them to be different for him to feel whole. That is the paradox of reparenting. It often improves external relationships without requiring change from others. Because when you are internally supported, you stop demanding that others play roles they cannot fulfill. The phrase, "it's never too late to have a happy childhood," doesn't mean rewriting history. It means giving yourself what history withheld: structure, warmth, boundaries, a repair, permission, and most importantly, presence. Reparenting is not a technique you master. It is a relationship you build with yourself. Some days Daniel still feels old fears rise, old habits whisper, old urgency returns, but now there is someone inside who notices, someone who doesn't panic, someone who doesn't punish, someone who doesn't disappear, that someone is him. And that is what a happy childhood ultimately provides. Not endless joy, but a reliable internal home. When you have that, the past loosens its grip, not because it was erased, but because it was integrated. Reparenting is not about going back. It's about finally moving forward, together with the parts of you that were left behind. And in that sense, it truly is never too late. Because the moment you begin to show up for yourself differently, something inside you recognizes it. And that recognition feels like relief. Not dramatic relief, quiet relief. The kind that says, I'm not alone anymore. I have me. And that is enough to begin again. The real measure of healing is often imagined as a destination, a moment when everything finally makes sense, when the past no longer hurts, when triggers disappear, when you can think about your parents and feel nothing or feel only peace. For a long time, Daniel believed this too. He thought healing would arrive as clarity so complete that the story would end. No more revisiting, no more questioning, no more emotional residue. But that moment never came. Instead, something quieter happened. The memories didn't vanish. The history didn't rewrite itself. And his parents didn't suddenly understand or apologize in the way some part of him once hoped they would. And yet, life felt different, not lighter in a dramatic way. More steady. This is where many people misunderstand healing. Healing is not the absence of pain. It is the absence of captivity. Daniel still had moments where old patterns surfaced, a familiar tightness in his chest, a reflex to self-correct, a flash of guilt after choosing himself. But those moments no longer controlled him. They passed. That was the difference. The real measure of healing is not how rarely you feel triggered, it's how quickly you return to yourself when you are. Early in his journey, Daniel measured progress by how calm he felt, how little he reacted, how mature he could be in difficult situations. When those standards weren't met, and he felt like he was failing at healing too, that too was conditioning. Narcissistic family systems often turn growth into performance. Healing can become another role to play, another standard to meet. But healing does not demand perfection. It reveals capacity. Daniel noticed this most clearly in moments of conflict. In the past, conflict consumed him. He replayed it, analyzed it, internalized it. Days or weeks could be lost to self-doubt. Now, conflict still hurt. But it didn't linger. His nervous system recovered faster. His self-trust returned sooner. His identity remained intact. That is healing. Healing looks like being able to disagree without disappearing, like feeling guilt without obeying it, like setting boundaries without rehearsing them endlessly, like being misunderstood without needing to correct the narrative. And healing is not emotional numbness. It is emotional mobility. Daniel still felt sadness about what he didn't receive growing up. That grief didn't vanish. But it no longer dictated his choices. He could feel it without drowning in it. This is another important truth. Grief is not a sign that healing failed. It is often a sign that healing is working. Because grief requires safety. You can't mourn what you never felt allowed to name. As Daniel became more internally secure, grief surfaced, not as collapse, but as clarity. He grieved not just what happened, but what never could. And then something surprising occurred. The grief softened into compassion, not for the behavior, but for the limitations. Not to excuse, but to contextualize. This compassion did not require reconnection. It did not require forgiveness. And it did not require reconciliation. It required honesty. Healing does not demand a specific outcome with your parents. Some relationships evolve. Some remain limited. Some end. There is no universal measure of success. The measure is internal. Can you stay regulated in your own body? Can you hear your own thoughts in the presence of others? Can you make choices based on values rather than fear? Daniel realized he had stopped asking, "Am I doing this right?" and started asking, "Does this feel aligned?" That shift changed everything. He no longer evaluated interactions solely by how they affected others. He included himself in the equation. That inclusion is the quiet hallmark of healing. Another marker of healing is the way time changes, not because the past becomes irrelevant, but because the present becomes richer. Daniel found himself thinking less about what should have happened and more about what he wanted now. His imagination was no longer anchored in repair fantasies. It became forward-facing. Healing is when the future opens up, not as pressure, as possibility. And here is where a gentle disclaimer matters. This work is not linear, it is not quick, and it is not something you do alone simply by understanding it. Healing from narcissistic parenting often requires support, professional, relational, and somatic. Therapy, coaching, and trauma-informed guidance can be crucial, especially when nervous system regulation and long-standing patterns are involved. This content is meant to offer insight and language, not diagnosis or treatment. Narcissistic personality disorder is a clinical condition that requires professional assessment. Not every difficult parent is narcissistic. Not every adult child with these patterns had narcissistic parents. What matters more than labels is impact. Healing focuses on how experiences shaped you, not on assigning pathology to others. Daniel learned this the hard way. Early on, he became consumed with definitions. Was it narcissism? Was it dysfunction? Was it trauma? He searched for certainty. Eventually, he realized that precision wasn't what he needed. He needed permission to take himself seriously. That permission did not come from a diagnosis. It came from listening to his own experience. Another real measure of healing is how you relate to complexity. In the beginning, Daniel needed clear villains and clear truths. Over time, he became more comfortable holding contradictions. His parents could have cared in some ways and failed in others. He could acknowledge harm without reducing people to it. That capacity is not denial, it is integration. Healing does not simplify the story. It deepens it. One of the most subtle but powerful signs of healing is reduced urgency. The urgency to explain, to fix, to prove, to be understood. Daniel noticed that he no longer needed to rush emotional resolution. If something felt unresolved, he trusted that he could return to it later. That trust was new. Healing creates patience, not because you stop caring, but because you stop panicking. And perhaps the most overlooked measure of healing is choice. Daniel still faced familiar situations, holidays, family conversations, old dynamics. The difference was that he now had options. He could engage or not. He could share or withhold. And he could stay or leave. And whatever he chose, he no longer abandoned himself in the process. Healing is when you can tolerate the discomfort of choice without defaulting to survival patterns. It is when your past informs you but no longer commands you. There were days Daniel still felt tired, still felt triggered, still questioned himself, but those days no longer defined him. They passed through a system that could hold them. That is the real measure of healing, not constant peace, not emotional perfection, not a resolved family narrative, but the ability to live a full life without shrinking, scanning, or self-erasing. And finally, this matters. Healing does not mean you become immune to pain. It means pain no longer convinces you that you are unsafe, unworthy, or alone. If you are somewhere in the middle of this journey, confused, grieving, angry, relieved, or all of it at once, there is nothing wrong with you. You are not late. You are not failing. You are not broken. You are doing something profoundly difficult, learning to live from the inside out after a lifetime of adaptation. Daniel's story does not end with resolution. It ends with agency, with presence, with self-trust, with an internal home that does not disappear under pressure. That is healing. Not the absence of scars, but the absence of captivity. And if this work resonates, let this be the final reminder. Take what serves you. Leave what doesn't. Seek support when needed. This is not about becoming someone else. It is about becoming free enough to be who you already are. Daniel's story is not dramatic on the surface. There is no single moment that explains everything, no obvious villain, no catastrophic memory that neatly ties his life together. And that is precisely why his journey matters. He grew up functional, capable, responsible. He learned early how to adapt, how to read emotional cues, how to stay composed. He became someone others relied on, someone who didn't cause problems, someone who appeared steady. But inside, his life was shaped by quiet forces he couldn't name for years. A voice that corrected before it comforted. A nervous system that stayed alert even in calm moments. A sense of guilt that appeared whenever he chose himself. A hope that someday, if he became good enough, everything would finally feel resolved. None of this felt abnormal to him. It felt like personality. Only later did he realize these were not traits he was born with. They were adaptations, intelligent responses to an emotional environment where connection required vigilance and self-erasure. Daniel's journey wasn't about blaming his parents or rewriting the past. It was about reclaiming authorship of his present. He learned that the harsh inner voice wasn't truth, it was training. That chronic guilt wasn't morality, it was conditioning. That anxiety wasn't weakness, it was a nervous system that had learned to survive uncertainty. That the fantasy of eventual recognition was keeping him emotionally unfinished. The turning point was not insight alone, it was differentiation. He learned to stay connected without collapsing, to hold boundaries without aggression, to feel discomfort without immediately fixing or fleeing, to recognize that other people's reactions were information, not commands. Then came reparenting, not as a technique, but as a relationship with himself. He began showing up consistently when things were hard. He stopped abandoning himself during failure. He learned to regulate instead of punish. He practiced giving himself what was missing: safety, permission, structure, and care. And slowly something shifted. The past didn't disappear, but it loosened its grip. Triggers still came, but they passed. Guilt still surfaced, but it no longer decided his behavior. Grief remained, but it became integrated rather than consuming. Healing did not make Daniel fearless. It made him grounded. The deepest lesson from his story is this: healing is not about becoming someone new. It is about no longer living from survival patterns that are no longer necessary. For those watching or listening, the application is not abstract. And if you notice a harsh inner voice, don't try to silence it. Get curious about what it's protecting. If guilt shows up when you rest or set boundaries, ask whether it's accurate or inherited. If calm feels uncomfortable, recognize that your nervous system may be unfamiliar with safety, not resistant to it. If you're waiting for someone to finally understand, consider whether that hope is costing you presence in your own life. You don't need perfect clarity to begin healing. You don't need a diagnosis. You don't need permission from the past. You need honesty with yourself and patience with your nervous system. And you need to know this: the fact that you're reflecting, questioning, and trying to live differently is not evidence that something is wrong with you. It is evidence that something inside you wants to be free. Before we end, let's pause for a moment of interaction. Quick question. Please comment A or B below. A. I often prioritize others' comfort over my own, even when it costs me. B. I'm learning to include myself when I make decisions, even if it feels uncomfortable. Just comment A or B. Then, if you're willing, share your perspective. What part of this story resonated with you the most? What insight are you sitting with right now? Your comment might be exactly what someone else needs to read. And if this content helped you feel seen, understood, or less alone, please subscribe to the channel. It's the best way to support this work and help us keep creating thoughtful, honest content about healing, growth, and reclaiming yourself after narcissistic family dynamics. You don't have to rush. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to carry this alone. And we'll keep going together.